Everyone knows that slavery is when someone else owns you. Freedom is when you own yourself. All individual rights stem from the concept of self-ownership. For example, the reason why consent is required for sex is because nobody gets to decide what you do with your body except for you. Unfortunately, we do not live in a society that respects self-ownership, and I don't just mean random criminal acts either. Slavery is embedded in the very structure of our society, right down to the relationship between government and citizens. Born into slavery, Frederick Douglass was in a unique position to see the parallels between outright chattel slavery, which is owning another human being outright, and other milder forms of slavery, where only a portion of your income, time, labor, and money is stolen from you by force without your consent. At some points, Frederick Douglass was essentially rented out by his master to work regular jobs, and then he was forced to pay all of that income to his master. In his 1855 book, My Bondage and My Freedom, Douglass explained, "Besides, I was now getting, as I have said, $1.50 per day. I contracted for it, worked for it, earned it, collected it. It was paid to me, and it was rightfully my own. And yet upon every returning Saturday night, this money, my own hard earnings, every cent of it, was demanded of me and taken from me by Master Hugh. He did not earn it. He had no hand in earning it. Why then should he have it? I owed him nothing. He had given me no schooling, and I had received from him only my food and raiment, and for these my services were supposed to pay from the first. The right to take my earnings was the right of the robber. He had the power to compel me to give him the fruits of my labor, and this power was his only right in the case." Douglass draws a distinction. His master had the power to make him a slave, but certainly not the right. And certainly the fact that his master provided him food and shelter did not justify the slavery. Whatever the master provided the slave with his own stolen money does not change the fact that Douglass did not consent to the arrangement. Douglass then explains what allows masters to keep men enslaved. To make a contented slave, you must make a thoughtless one. It is necessary to darken his morale and mental vision, and as far as possible, to annihilate his power of reason. He must be able to detect no inconsistencies in slavery. The man that takes his earnings must be able to convince him that he has a perfect right to do so. It must not depend upon mere force. The slave must know no higher law than his master's will. The whole relationship must not only demonstrate to his mind its necessity, but its absolute rightfulness. If there be one crevice through which a single drop can fall, it will certainly rust off the slave's chains. Douglass also recounted the advice he received from his master on how to live a happy life as a slave. He exhorted me to content myself and be obedient. He told me if I would be happy, I must lay out no plans for the future. He said if I behaved myself properly, he would take care of me. Indeed, he advised me to complete thoughtlessness of the future, and taught me to depend solely upon him for happiness. He seemed to see fully the pressing necessity of setting aside my intellectual nature in order to contentment in slavery. But in spite of him, and even in spite of myself, I continued to think, and to think about the injustice of my enslavement, and the means of escape. One arrangement in slavery was that a slave would be allowed to essentially go out and live his own life, but he would be forced to pay a percentage of his income to his master. A slave was essentially renting ownership of himself. Frederick Douglass found himself in this situation, and felt no better for it. I could see no reason why I should, at the end of each week, pour the reward of my toil into the purse of my master. He would, however, when I made him $6, sometimes give me 6 cents to encourage me. It had the opposite effect. I regarded it as a sort of admission of my right to the whole. The fact that he gave me any part of my wages was proof, to my mind, that he believed me entitled to the whole of them. I always felt worse for having received anything, for I feared that the giving me a few cents would ease his conscience, and make him feel himself to be a pretty honorable sort of robber. To Douglass, this arrangement was the worst of both worlds. I was to be allowed all my time, make all contracts with those for whom I worked, and find my own employment, and in return for this liberty, I was to pay him $3 at the end of each week. Find myself in caulking tools and board and clothing. My board was $2.50 per week. This, with the wear and tear of clothing and caulking tools, made my regular expenses about $6 per week. This amount I was compelled to make up or relinquish the privilege of hiring my time. Rain or shine, work or no work, at the end of each week, the money must be forthcoming or I must give up my privilege. This arrangement, it would be perceived, was decidedly in my master's favor. It relieved him of all need of looking after me. His money was sure. He received all the benefits of slaveholding without its evils, while I endured all the evils of a slave and suffered all the care and anxiety of a free man. According to how much of his wages and labor were taken by his master, Douglass was 100% a slave at times, and other times 99% a slave, and even at one point 50% a slave. But he was still a slave because he did not own himself. But in 1838, Douglass embarked on his second attempt to escape slavery. Frederick Douglass disguised himself as a free black sailor. He boarded a train in Maryland with a sailor's protection pass borrowed from a free black man he knew, and after a few close calls, Douglass arrived in New York. With the help of abolitionists, he found safety in New Bedford, Massachusetts, and began his life as a free man. Don't let the masters keep you a thoughtless slave. It's really hard for me to read these quotes from Frederick Douglass and not think about all the parallels with being the citizen of a government which forces you to give a percentage of your labor. Now, just like Frederick Douglass says, the fact that he receives room and board in exchange for that labor doesn't change the fact that he has no say in the arrangement. It is not a consensual arrangement. So it would be one thing if the government said, if you want, pay us 50% of your wages and we'll provide security and education and whatever else. But they don't ask your permission. They just do it. There's no consent, and without consent, that does not make you a free agent in that transaction. It's extortion. And just like the taxpayer, Douglass was not always 100% a slave. He didn't owe 100% of his earnings to his master. Sometimes he only owed about 50%. And like he says, this is the worst of both worlds. You have all the stress of a free man. You have all the stress of making your own arrangements. If you fail, that's on you. But if you succeed, the government still, the master still, takes a portion of your earnings without consent. And before you think that I'm being petty, I realize there's a huge difference between outright ownership of another human being and the arrangement that we have with the government right now. But don't you think that it basically allows the government to get away with the same abuses of a slave master because we have no consent in this arrangement? If we are able to pull our support away from the government and say, I don't want your services and I don't want to pay you half of my income, wouldn't that be a little bit more control over our own freedom? One more note. I think some people might use this as like a socialist argument to say that they're being forced into the same sort of arrangement with a business or the bourgeoisie and being forced to hand over part of their productive value to the business owner. The difference is consent. If you come to an agreement with the business owner, then you are agreeing to hand over a portion of that. And by the way, that's not for free. They're providing you their tools and their capital with which to make your living. That's a pretty solid arrangement, but you should be allowed to say, no, I'll either go to a different business owner or I'll set up my own way. Now, what is keeping everybody from setting up their own life and just living off the fruits of their own labor? Again, it's the government. You can't just own a piece of land without the government claiming that you owe them a rent or property tax. Again, there's no agreement here. That's taken without your consent, and so you can't just grab a piece of land, work for a piece of land, plant it, live your own life, and say, no, I'm not going to work in this capitalist structure. The types of societies that I envision and that I talk about, you could do that. You could be a socialist in a capitalist society. You just get a piece of land and you have your socialist utopia. It doesn't work the other way because we're essentially living under socialism right now. It's that lack of consent, that lack of say in how you're being governed, how your money's being spent, and if you want those services in exchange for your labor. This is why. Why are you a slave? It's extortion, it's robbery to pay taxes without that consent. What makes it slavery? Just think about it in terms of your time instead of your money. It takes time to earn money. The average person, I think they say, works from January through April for the United States government in order to pay those taxes. That means for 4 months of the year, you are enslaved to the government and you owe them that taxes, or they will come for you. They will put you in prison. If you resist, they'll kill you. Now tell me that is not a slave-master relationship. The parallels are also pretty unnerving when Douglass is talking about what it takes to make a contented slave. To make a contented slave, you must make a thoughtless one. It's necessary to darken his morale and mental vision, and as far as possible, annihilate his power of reason. It's for the same reasons that you really shouldn't be trusting the government to educate your children. Because the government depends on us to be contented slaves in order to prop up their power structure. It must not depend upon mere force. A slave must know no higher law than his master's will. And again, if you're watching this and you're saying, how ridiculous that I'm thinking of a government as a slave master when they give us so much in return, those great roads, that great Department of Education, all that defense in the form of bombing the Middle East. The government gives us all that, and I'm going to sit here and say that we're slaves to the master when clearly he's providing us a lot in return. If you're sitting there and thinking that, I hate to say it, but you know no law higher than your master's will. It's the same thing when Frederick Douglass says, he exhorted me to content myself and be obedient. He told me that if I would be happy, I must lay no plans for the future. Depend entirely on him. Depend entirely on the master. Depend on Social Security. You think that's going to be there for you in a few years? Depend on the US dollar, which loses at least 3% of its value every year due to inflation, robbed from your savings. You have to set aside your intellectual nature in order for contentment in slavery. Looking forward to hearing from all you in the comments. Tell me what you think of my assessment here. Don't forget to like this video, share it with friends, it's really important, and subscribe to the channel for more content like this. Come back and see me again soon.